Can we move the rocks? This question, first asked of Sabra and then relayed to me this week, came from the leaders of a Bible study group now resuming meetings in our sanctuary. Made up of college-aged young people, the group has changed noticeably since they last met here in 2020. There's nothing like college to, make a whole new group every couple of years. Some students have graduated, others have arrived and joined. Their name and their leadership have been changed, and they, like all of us, are trying to figure out their way forward. So in preparing to return to our space for their Friday Bible studies, the group walked through the building as Sabra showed them around and shared our updated policies. As they walked through the sanctuary, the group leaders looked around and asked, "Can we move the rocks?" And Sabra shared their question with me, and my response was immediate, clear, and probably a little more abrupt than I expected. No, you cannot move the rocks. The strength of that answer surprised me because I do like to think of myself as something of a flexible person. Yeah, laugh. Thinking about it later, but I think I came to understand what it was. To me, a pile or a collection of stones, especially those in our sanctuary, is each its own kind of cairn. Do you know what a cairn is? Some of you, maybe not all. Simply put, it's a big pile of rocks that are placed in a location for a specific purpose. They're there on purpose. In lots of places, cairns are built to mark the top of a mountain or a hill or some other kind of geographical landmark. Since ancient times, cairns have been used and served as part of national survey grids, like really old school mappings. That's how you know where something is. And if it changes a little, then they take the cairn apart and put a new one together. In coastal areas, they tend to be painted white so that they can act as beacons for ships, and the lights from the ships will bounce off of the rocks and let the ship know not to come that far. Cairns are also commonly found along hiking trails to mark the passage of an individual through an area or to let hikers know they're still on the right path. You know how much I would give for that sort of thing in my spiritual life sometimes? Yes, still on the right path, keep going, or nope, hopelessly lost. Good to know. And some places, many places around the world, you can find a cairn on a battlefield as a marker for those who've been lost. Some think that comes from the old ancient burial cairns in Britain and Ireland, and from the Scottish Highlanders' tendency to build a pile of stones, one for each person at the beginning of a battle, and remove the ones for the men who lived at the end, leaving behind a marker, a memory of those who'd passed. The cairns I know best are the ones I've seen in Scotland. You will, of course, find ancient megaliths and stone circles throughout the region, many of which were likely used for spiritual purposes. But even today, people keep creating cairns. It's traditional there, if you're going to hike someplace or go up a hill, that you pick up a stone at the bottom of the hill. And when you get to the top, you place it on the top of the cairn. An old Scottish blessing reflects that practice. I'll put a stone on your stone. I love that image, that we're all traveling along, right? I'll put a stone on your stone. I'll leave a marker where we met. I think I like them so much because to me, cairns are altars. And every time I pass one, it's like being reminded of the presence of God. The ancient ones say that God has been there for a long, long time, longer than anybody's memory. And the new ones say that God is present still in each and every moment, in each and every person who passes that way. I suppose that understanding of little altars everywhere was taught to me by scriptures like the one we heard this morning. Abram builds an altar in the place where he met God as some kind of physical way to mark this spiritual experience, this moment when he encountered all that was holy. Patty, do you remember being in the Holy Land? And everywhere you go, every important biblical thing, somebody put up a building, right? They took it to another level. It's like a shrine everywhere. And sometimes you go places and there's a Catholic one and an Orthodox one right next to each other because, you know, the sharing is hard. I like to imagine, though, that we too are building altars where we go. I like to imagine us carrying stones in our pockets and leaving them along the path anywhere we find God, so that someone else can come along and see it and think maybe they're on a right track. A little trail of rocks through our day. These altars might be in actual places, physical or geographical locations, or they might be housed in the hearts and minds and souls of other people. We might build altars in the spaces between us, in those moments that we find God in our relationships with each other. We might build them in a memory, living in our mind's eye of a time or place that was sacred to us. We might even build them in the silence of our own hearts, places that nobody else knows to go, but God always finds a way in. A friend of mine speaks about that kind of altar. She and I were talking once about grief and loss and disappointment. She's a therapist for a complementary medicine clinic that treats cancer patients and their families. So even when somebody comes in complaining about the traffic, it's always about more than the traffic. I said something to her once about how, for me, grief must be lived until it's healed enough that I can put it in a box and put it on a shelf, maybe kind of like a shrine. And when I need to, I can go and I take it down and I open the box and I go back into the grief or sit with it for a while. And sometimes there's some kind of emotional earthquake and it gets knocked off the shelf and there it comes. And I have to put it all back away again. My friend nodded and said she had a different idea. She said in her losses, she'd learned to build to each of them an altar in her soul. Sometimes she just sits quietly before it. Sometimes she goes and cries at it. And sometimes she says she has to make pilgrimage to it, to come and ask her questions, and let that altar ask questions of her until God meets her there again, until she receives the gifts offered to her, until she's enfolded in God's arms and held and rocked and known and loved, until those places of grief and pain are offered up and healed, redeemed, and made whole. In his book, Praying with Our Hands, author John Sweeney reminds us that altars have often been used in both public and personal ways. In churches and temples all over the world, people meet at the altar in the sanctuary. It's a place where couples are married and babies are blessed and holy meals are shared and people are welcomed and goodbyes are offered. Some churches find the altar to be the holiest space in the room, and they reserve it only for those who are ordained. We too recognize the power of an altar, a physical landmark of a spiritual experience. Because of that, we want people to get as close to it as they possibly can. I want the children climbing all over it. I want the adults to come and put their hands on it. I want whatever physical expression of the desire to be close to God you can think of, to remind us that God is in our midst. It's why it feels so far away, so we bring the table that much closer, because that too is an altar, meant to remind us that God is in the midst of us, not far away and unreachable, but right here next to us. We want to build an altar, a marker in absolutely every place we've ever felt the presence of God. And we want to go out into the world and read the altars that other people have built, so we can know how God has been present there too. Maybe it's the desire to get as close as possible to holy places that accounts for the personal altars that Sweeney describes. Increasingly common today are home altars, he says, an assemblage of personal objects that remind one of God or of things that symbolize divine blessings. The home altar can be our set-aside place for honoring the Holy One and blessing God's guidance and goodness. We can use our hands to create a sacred place that shows the divine as we know it. We can use our hands to create a sacred place. Sometimes we need more than the words or even the silences. We need to do something to remind us that God is in our midst, to see with our fingers as well as our eyes, because I don't think we ever really grow out of that need to touch and feel and see and smell that which draws us closer to God. We never get over the desire to get as close as we can. So I want to give us some time right now to help to build an altar in our midst, an altar to God, in honor and memory of those who've built them in our hearts and our souls. We have a number of different kinds of elements here: stones and candles, water and sand, representations of earth and wind and fire and water. I've started things a little bit so you get a sense of some of the possibilities. Julie's going to play a little bit of music, and she does. I invite you to come forward and put something somewhere in a way that resonates with your spirit. Maybe you are going to light a candle. Maybe you are going to put a stone onto the cross or into the sand. Maybe you're going to hold it in your hand and then slip it into the water. Maybe you're going to pour some water or sand into each of those clear vases. And if we all do that together, the altar we make is much more satisfying than if we made it all on our own, right? That is way more elaborate than what I had intended to build. And that makes it even more beautiful. Come and let your prayers take a physical form. Come and let us build. In our hearts and our lives, let us go and build altars to God, little altars everywhere. Amen.